Hey everyone, Liam here. Welcome to this week's video. This week's video we're going to be going over how to paint the shield on Odun that you can see on screen at the moment. As always, if you've got any questions or any feedback, feel free to leave them in the comments below. If you do want to support me or you do want to see the rest of the videos based on this model, feel free to check out my Patreon and the rest of the links in the description below. But as always, I appreciate the support. If you do like it, hit that like button and here we go. So we need to start this model with a quick transition from our lighter area to our darker area. Now, the reason why I say quick, because we don't need to worry about a really smooth blend on this, because we are going to be pretty much covering all of it. And chances are we're going to make a lot of mistakes when we do the freehand. So if we spend loads of time getting an amazing transition, you're going to have to fix all of that work when you try and put the freehand pattern over it. So all I've done here, this is Vallejo model color dark Prussian blue, and it's over a black base coat, nice and simple. And then what I'm going to do towards the bottom, I'm going to slap loads of black on the bottom half of it, which is where it's going to be darker for me. And then while both of those paints are still wet, I'm going to mix them together. So I'm effectively going to wet blend these two colors together. Now, when we're wet blending, the idea being realistically, we want our paint to be as opaque as possible, really. We don't want it to be too thin. We just need to thin it enough so it breaks the surface tension on the paint. And if you're unsure of doing that, feel free to check out the wet blending video that's available on the Patreon. But you can see, first of all, I've put down the dark Prussian blue. This gives us a nice dark base coat to start working with. And then what I'll do is I'm laying down that Vallejo model color black on the bottom half. Then I'm going over with on the top half with the Vallejo model color dark Prussian blue again. And then when they're on there, I'm then mixing them together with a side to side brush stroke motion. And I'm pushing and pulling those two colors together. Again, I'm not going to go over it too much in detail on this. I'm effectively wet blending these two colors together for a very fast blend. Does not need to be perfect. We are going to be covering all of this up, and chances are when we start doing the freehand, we're going to make mistakes. So you can see me mixing on the wet palette there. I've added some Vallejo model color pale grey blue to the wet palette, and I've mixed in some of the Vallejo model color dark Prussian blue into the pale grey blue. The idea with this is I don't quite, the pale grey blue is a very bright grey, and I didn't want it that dark, and I wanted the freehand. I didn't want the freehand on the shield to stand out too much. So by mixing a bit of the dark Prussian blue, it kind of integrates this pattern into the shield, so it's going to end up looking less prominent. But any grey will do, and any blue will do. You don't need to copy my exact colors. So the first thing that I've done is I've painted two lines on either side of the shield. These lines run roughly parallel with the metallic trim, and then I painted a dot in the middle of that shield panel. And this is my guide. So no matter what, as long as I copy those lines on each section of the shield, as long as I copy the position of that dot, when I join them up, I'll get something symmetrical. So the other thing before we talk about the rest of the plan for the freehand to get it the right size every time, it's worth noting that all of the lines that I'm painting, these are the center of the lines. All of these lines are going to be made wider. The reason for that is if we start with the center of the pattern, the lines in the pattern, what happens is when we have something like this, which looks terrible because it's not symmetrical, we can make each one of those lines wider. So it gives us the flexibility to adjust that pattern to make it symmetrical. So we can make the lines wider on either side. So you can see here where it's closer towards that trim, I've now straightened out that line and I've moved it closer to the trim, and I'm doing the same on this side. So I've got a nice symmetrical pattern. So I can adjust by painting the center of the lines very roughly and adjust those lines later so they become symmetrical and match each other. Because unless you're specifically going for an asymmetric finish, as soon as you paint something, if it's not symmetrical, it's going to look very out of place, and your eyes are going to pick it out, and it's going to look very even if you can't understand the issue with it, your brain is going to understand that that pattern does not match the other side of it. So we need to be very careful of this. So this is where we need to take our time. Start with when we're painting the line, we need to make sure that we start with the middle of the lines, because then we can just keep making that adjustments. When it comes to painting lines, this whole shield is going to be about how well you can paint lines. I say this on so many of my videos, so many times when I'm painting. Painting lines is one of the most important skills that you can have as a miniature painter, because it comes into play so often. So first thing that I would say is, for a start, use a better brush than I have. You can clearly tell that the brush I'm using it's not terrible, but I clearly haven't looked after it. There's paint all the way up to the metal part. The brush isn't in great condition. Use a decent brush, especially if you're not so used to doing this. So when I say a decent brush, you want a brush with a decent point. Now you can use a small brush if it's going to help you. Remember, the brush that you use should be whatever is going to benefit you the most, not what people are telling you. I'm using quite a large brush because I know the point is okay, and the belly of the brush is holding quite a lot of paint. So what that means is I can work with the paint that's in my brush for longer. I don't have to keep going back and getting more paint. That works for me because I'm a little bit more experienced with this. If you're unsure, then there's nothing wrong with using a smaller brush. It just means that you're going to have to keep going back to your wet palette more and more often. But the idea with this is you need a nice point. Make sure that you remove any excess paint from your brush. And what you want to do is, before you do your brush mark, you want to test your brush stroke on your hand or a piece of kitchen roll or tissue or something like that. Because remember, if you've got too much paint on your brush, if you test it off the model first of all, then whatever is going to go wrong is going to go wrong off the model, and you're not going to ruin what you've painted. If you haven't got enough paint on your brush, then you're going to know very quickly, and then that makes things, that solves the issue. So remember, if you're going to make a mistake, make the mistake off the model. So test your brush stroke off the model first. It's really important. With the paint consistency on this, Vallejo model color are quite an opaque paint. They have very good coverage. So I don't need to thin my paint too much. This is probably 2 parts water to 1 part paint, because I'm going for a nice opaque result. The idea being is I want the paint to be as opaque as possible while giving me enough fluidity to get a nice line. So I'm only thinning it just enough. Realistically, I only want to do 1 coat. I only want to do 1 layer of paint when it comes to this freehand, because freehand is naturally can be quite difficult to do, and if you've got to keep doing the same thing over and over, you're just giving yourself more work, and it's making it more challenging. So it depends on the paint brand you're using. How thin you want your paint is going to depend on the paint. If you're using, so for example, if you're using a GW paint or something like P3, potentially you're going to have to do a couple of coats, because those paints are a little bit thinner. They're not as opaque, as Vallejo model color. So just something to think about. You can see, like, I've been painting along while I've been rambling. With this, all I'm doing now is I'm making all of these lines larger and larger, so they're all the same size, or roughly, and I'm fixing the symmetry of those lines. So you can see at the moment that that line, the square in the middle, that looks really off at the moment. Those lines are not running parallel to each other. But because I can make these lines larger, they're still not as thick as they need to be. I can now make the adjustments to make it more symmetrical. And the other thing is as well, although I haven't done it in this video, if you make a mistake and you make the lines too large, or you've done your freehand and you've got a little bit of blue paint, the bright blue grey paint, onto the blue shield, because we haven't made any effort with the blue shield yet, it's really easy to fix. You just go back with the dark Prussian blue and cover it up. This is one of the reasons why I prefer not to use an airbrush as well. There's nothing wrong with airbrushes. Before anyone gives me grief, airbrushes are great, and if you enjoy them, then by all means use them. But once you airbrush something, the result, if you make a mistake on that airbrush surface, the result is very hard to fix with a paintbrush. So for me personally, I prefer to do it all with a paintbrush, because then I don't have to deal with that. But whatever works for you is fine. I don't particularly airbrush anymore because I don't enjoy the process. So it's just one of those things. So you can see me just fixing the square in the middle, and you can see that I was using that dark Prussian blue paint. So just by leaving what we have behind the freehand very simple, it's incredibly easy to fix. So I've jumped ahead here. The only thing that's changed is I've sketched in the non-metal metallic, which I'm not going over in this video. That's going to be a separate video because it's quite complicated. And I've painted the patterns on all 4 areas. That's all I've done. So you haven't missed anything that's going to be relevant to show you, and that's not going to overly make the video too long. This is now where we need to start making this material look natural. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to start breaking the barrier between that freehand pattern and the wood behind it. So what we're going to do is I've added a small amount of the pale grey blue to my mix, and this is the same mix that I used to paint the freehand. Now what I'm going to start doing is painting, as you can see, tiny little lines randomly on the shield. Now the idea with this is at this point in time I'm only going over the freehand, because if I go over the blue too much, it's going to look very strange. There's nothing wrong with some of the lines going over the blue, so like over the freehand into the dark blue area, because that will start to help break those hard lines of the freehand. The problem with the freehand when we start is it looks very unnatural because we've just got this massive jump from the freehand color to the shield. So we need to start pulling that together. Now, I said at the beginning, this is very much, this whole model, this whole shield is very much about painting, being able to paint lines. So if you're struggling with your brush control, remember, restore your point, check your brush stroke off the model. And when you're doing your brush stroke, exhale as you do your brush stroke, because that will settle your hands and it will help reduce hand shake. Obviously, if you've got medical issues why your hands are shaking, that's not going to help. But for people who just have shaky hands for whatever reason, exhaling as you do it will make a huge difference. So the next step is, you can see that I've mixed up a bit of blue. This is the dark Prussian blue with some white. So there's 2 color mixes that we're using here. If we're going over freehand colors, what I'm using is that pale grey blue, dark Prussian blue mix, and I'm making it darker and brighter with more dark Prussian blue or more white. I'm going over the blue background of the shield. Then what I'm doing is I'm using the pure dark Prussian blue and I'm adding pure white or pure black, because this is going to give us 2 different tones of blue that will match the surfaces behind it. And the idea being, I'm painting lots of very small lines separate to each other, so the previous work that we've done still shows through, but those lines are going over each other. So you can see with the bright grey blue, I'm going into the dark blue behind it. This breaks that pattern. And then in some areas with that dark blue, the dark Prussian blue mix of the shield behind the freehand, I'm going into the freehand areas. So this breaks those hard lines and it integrates these 2 patterns together. And you can see very early on, this is starting to look quite natural. And all I'm doing, can't stress this enough, is just painting very thin lines. The thinner the lines that you do, the nicer the result you will get. You do want, so the idea with this is you want to put down these lines and you want the color underneath to influence them. So this is where it can be quite difficult. If you're painting the lines on the model and you can't see, they're drying and you can't really see any difference, your paint is too thin. You want a relatively opaque mark with not a lot of paint on your brush. So you've got to remember as well, with the exception of these panel lines, these lines that I'm painting in now, those are the sculpted planks of wood. The rest of the texture on this shield, there isn't any, it's all flat. So the texture that we're creating is entirely based on our freehand that we're doing, and this is all about those lines. So the first thing, as I said, that we've done is with a mix of the freehand color, which is slightly brighter, we're painting lines in the freehand area to break that flat color that we have. And in the darker area of our blue, we've mixed a slightly brighter blue. We're painting lines into that dark blue, into those dark blue areas to break that flat surface that we have. So next up, we now need to go darker and lighter with these little lines that we're making. So first of all, not obviously, but in the darker sections of the shield, remember the lower half of the shield needs to be darker. I'm pushing almost to black with these lines. Now, what I would say with the black, because I'm thinning it out, because it is being thinned, it's somewhat transparent. So when we go over, it's not actually going to be pure black. It will come out like a very dark blue. So that's something to think about. I didn't want to be using black on this shield because it can look very unnatural. But where previously what we did was lots of little lines with the freehand color with a little bit of white added in. The difference is now we're being more extreme with it. When I'm painting these lines in, you can see that these lines are now much, much darker. They've got more black in them. And I'm being a bit more aggressive about going over the freehand and also the blue areas. This is because we're imitating a worn wood. So what we're effectively imitating is like damage and the grain in the wood. Now, the depth of scratches and the grain and that sort of stuff is going to vary all the time. So by putting different values of color, because that's what we're doing here, but we're putting different values in. So some of the lines are lighter, some of them are darker. And with the variation that we have in these lines, it gives the impression that some of these marks are deeper than others. And by making these lines go from the freehand into the blue paint behind it, it gives the impression that it helps with the idea that this is all one material surface. And it helps with the idea that if there is a grain in this wood, it continues regardless of the actual paint on the model. So the grain is still there's still going to be a grain, whether we have that freehand paint over the top of it or whether we have that dark blue paint over the top of it. So this is really important that we need to think about, is those lines, can't stress this enough for this to work, those lines that we're painting need to continue regardless of whether you're painting it over the light pattern or the dark blue behind it. And you can see now I'm going quite extreme. This is quite a bright grey. Now it looks brighter than it actually is because it's going over a very dark surface. Ultimately this shield is quite dark. So when we put a light paint over that dark, it looks even brighter than it is. This looks quite like it's getting quite close to white, whereas in fact it's not in the slightest. The other thing that I'd probably say that I found was quite important was the actual separation of the planks of wood that the sculptor has given us. So you can see them, those really hard dark lines. They're very difficult to see naturally when we're looking at this model. So we need to make sure that the actual planks of wood in the shield are clearly readable. So with that is when we paint these lines, we need to make sure that we paint these lines and we do like an edge highlight along the separation of the planks. So where those two planks meet and there's a gap between them, we need to make sure that we edge highlight them as well, because that makes the model so it's very clear to read what is going on. Remember, readability is really important when we're painting miniatures, because we're painting something so small. Sometimes we need to move away from the idea of something being realistic, and sometimes we need to make more artistic choices to make it make more sense, because we need to look at this model from far away and understand exactly what we're looking at. So sometimes we need to go a little bit extreme with what we're doing, and that's really important, especially with those edge highlights, because all of a sudden we've got this wooden texture. Once we put those edge highlights in, we can also see that this wooden texture comes with the separation of planks, because not everyone is going to look at this model really up close, regardless of how you're displaying it. If it's displayed in your house, most people are just going to see it from far away. If you're viewing it online, not everyone is going to really go up close and zoom in on your pictures to see what's going on. So being able to understand what's happening from far away is incredibly important. So remember, sometimes we sacrifice realism with a more artistic choice to give us the imitation of realism. You can see now as well, now I'm going over the blue quite a lot. I've been working the freehand areas quite a lot to get that texture. Now I'm painting these brighter lines into the blue itself. This is because at the moment we don't have a lot. We've got a lot of texture in the freehand pattern, but not a huge amount of texture or material surface, whatever you want to call it, in the actual blue painted area. So this is where we start adding that now. So the brighter color here is going to be the more important, because we've got such, because this blue is so dark, going brighter is what's going to give us the texture that we can see from far away, the striking texture. So we need to go brighter with these lines, but we still also need to be careful because we want to keep it quite dark. So I appreciate that can sound a bit off, but the idea is we want to build these lines up very slowly and with that fairly thin paint. So when we place the paint down, we're still showing that dark color through. This is really important. We still need the previous layers to show through. Otherwise, we're just going to end up with a bright blue shield, and it's not gonna. We're not going to have any. We're not going to have any contrast. So remember, when we're looking at this, for me, the most important type of contrast is contrast in value, contrast in light and dark. And that's what I'm constantly aiming for. So you can see the shield at the moment is working. The texture is right. The texture, at this point, I've decided that the texture is pretty spot on. I really like where it's at. But I'm looking at this shield now and I'm thinking, do you know what? I don't have enough contrast in value right now. It doesn't go bright enough. It doesn't go dark enough. So I need to change that. It's looking very flat at the moment. So you can see the shield's changed a little bit here. I haven't painted any more of the wood pattern right now. What I've painted is the steel non-metal metallic, right? Now, I want to point out with this really shows how something changes when you paint the areas around it. I say this so often in videos on Twitch, on YouTube, like when you paint the area around something, it fundamentally changes how you view the other areas. So before I made any decisions with this shield looking a little bit flat, I painted the rest of the non-metal metallic to see, sorry, I've finished the non-metal metallic before I made any decisions on what to do with the shield. And that's something that's really important. Sometimes you need to paint other areas before you make a final decision. So you can see that I'm painting the lines on at the moment in the darker area of the shield. This is near enough pure black, to be honest with you. I knew that I wanted to darken the shadow, especially after finishing the non-metal metallic, or mostly finishing the non-metal metallic. It's not quite done at this stage, but... And then I'm brightening up the top area of the top half of the shield. So ultimately, to brighten up or darken it down, we're just going to paint brighter lines or darker lines. This is it. It's just all about those lines. You just need to make sure that you keep previous paint layers showing through. These lines should be not close together. They should have gaps between them. And as you gradually build up those lines, you'll get brighter in the brighter areas and even darker in the darker areas. It really is that straightforward. The problem is I'm not going to lie to you. It takes a certain amount of practice before, like, you need to do it to understand what I'm talking about. So all I can suggest is that you give it a go. And you can see here with those brighter lines that I've just started putting down there's massive gaps between them. Those are like just odd little lines kind of randomly placed throughout the top half of the shield. You don't need a lot. You really, like, you'd be surprised the power of just a couple of marks. You'd be surprised the impact that a couple of marks will have on you painting a textured surface and trying to get it brighter. So that's it. That's the shield that you can see on screen at the moment, all finished. As always, I hope it's helpful. Try to be as clear as possible. I appreciate this is quite a difficult subject to explain. But if you get any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below and I'll get back to you. But once again, thanks everyone for the support, and I'll catch you later.